Republican Greg Abbott signed the law in May, which prohibits terminations after cardiac activity can be detected, which is usually around 6 weeks before most women even know they're pregnant, many people calling it the heartbeat bill. This is the strictest limit placed on women's reproductive rights in the United States since Roe v. Wade in 1973. Around 12 other states have tried to implement early pregnancy bans, but they have been blocked from going into effect. Well, Dr. Callum Miller, an ethicist at Oxford University, is here with us to talk through these changes. I mean, Dr. Callum, many liberal societies are actually liberalising restrictions for women for access to their reproductive health, but this law is restricting it. What is the rationale for this?
Yeah, so I think actually in most developed countries, including the US and the UK, there's clear public opinion polling, especially from women, saying that the law is too permissive. In the UK, for example, it's legal to have an abortion up to 24 weeks for any reason and up to birth if the child has a disability. And likewise in the US, the law is very similar, but actually even more extreme. And polling clearly shows that women do not support this, and they think there should be more compassionate, humane, science-based limits on abortion. And so I think having a year of being told to follow the science, I think it's good that we're finally beginning to do so, realizing that the heart starts to beat very early in pregnancy, and that ending the life of a child whose heart is beating is often something that is not the most humane thing for a society to encourage.
You mentioned public opinion polling, but we're not talking about something that, you poll people down the street to find out. We're talking about women's reproductive health. And we know that, for example, many women don't even know they're pregnant after 6 weeks. And there's a whole range of reasons why women might need access to that. So bringing up public opinion polling isn't necessarily relevant. I mean, for example, wouldn't this be pushing women to more dangerous options or going to different states to access abortion? This is about their reproductive rights, isn't it?
Well, I think all of us agree that rights have certain limits. So all of us would agree that abortion in the third trimester or at 8 months of pregnancy is not something that should be allowed. And the reason is because there are two people involved. There is the woman and the child, and the law needs to protect both as much as is possible. And so that's what I think Texas is trying to do, trying to support women and trying to support their children and balance those rights carefully, following the science in doing so. I don't think it's really the case that women will be pushed to more unsafe methods. In Poland, for example, where abortion is not permitted for any reason except the life of the mother and for sexual assault, their maternal mortality rate is the lowest in the entire world. Malta, likewise, in Europe, has no abortion for any reason except the mother's life, and yet they have had no maternal deaths from any cause in the last 10 years. So really, this is something which is an outdated argument, really from the 19th century, frankly, and is not something that is really relevant in contemporary healthcare systems.
But we're talking about the most restrictive law in America. This idea that that Texas is the champion for women's rights when it comes to American society, isn't that a bit of a stretch?
Well, I think what women themselves tell us is important. I mean, opinion polling shows that women are actually more pro-life than men in many countries, including the UK. And it clearly shows that they do not support these radical abortion laws, which allow abortion up until the moment of birth in the US. And so I think Texas is really doing what the majority of women feel is the right thing. They are listening to women. They are trusting women. And the alternative is to trust a tiny radical minority of activists, most of whom are men, actually, in suggesting that the current law should remain in place, which would allow abortion up until birth.
You mentioned the fact that most of the people in the radical minority are men. Are a lot of the people signing off on this law men?
So the law, I haven't looked at the specific makeup of the Texas legislature, so I wouldn't be able to say. But what I would say is that women have been at the forefront of the pro-life movement for many decades, despite people trying to portray the opposite. As I say, public opinion polling shows that women are more pro-life than men. Women overwhelmingly staff the crisis pregnancy help centers, of which there are over 200 in Texas, helping women and babies to flourish rather than trying to pit them against each other.
But I mean, it's not people that are sceptical of this law pitting it against each other. I think many of them are concerned about women's reproductive rights and the safety of women and girls when they're in situations that they aren't able to cope with. But another question I have for you, I mean, do you support sex education? Because in Texas and in places like Texas, they often teach abstinence. So we're actually essentially arguing for a generation who don't have access to reproductive health care, but also don't fully understand the implications of if they did engage in sexual activity. So would you support better sex education in school in Texas or in any part of the Western societies?
Yeah, so I think obviously everyone supports good sex education by definition. You know, everyone should be informed about the relevant biological realities, including the fact that the heart of the baby starts beating 3 weeks after conception, that the brain waves are active and detectable from about 6 weeks after conception, and of course how babies are made and how to avoid that when women aren't ready. But what I would say is that this kind of narrative and this myth really that sex education generally stops unplanned pregnancies doesn't really stand up to empirical scrutiny. There are 2 Cochrane reviews showing clearly that sex education doesn't really work. But actually, one of the main studies they highlight is an abstinence education program, which was a randomized control trial and showed very, very powerful effects in reducing teenage pregnancy. So that's not to, give... I'm not going to speak forever about this topic, but I do think we need to challenge some of these common myths around sex education and unplanned pregnancy.
Dr. Callum, thank you very much for coming on. Dr. Callum Miller, there, ethicist, which is easy for me to say, at Oxford University.